Dead America, Lowcountry Part 15. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 26. "Oh, that is some grade A bullshit there, Captain," Coleman drawled. He, Terrell, Dante, Ace, Lily, and Francis sat around a large table in the cafeteria. Everyone burst into laughter at Coleman, who'd reacted to a story his captain had told from his days overseas. Terrell put a hand to his chest in faux offense. "How dare you insinuate that I would embellish my record?" he asked with a gasp. "I tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, all hours of the day, and twice on Sundays." Coleman huffed and crossed his arms, giving his captain a knowing look. "So, anyway, I bust into this building, and there are 2 7-foot-tall dudes," Terrell continued, and the whole table erupted into laughter at his exaggeration. He raised his palms and shook his head. All right. They weren't 7 feet tall, but they were a couple of big boys." Coleman raised an eyebrow. "Captain," he warned. Terrell rolled his eyes and shook his head. "Okay, fine. But I can tell you with 100% certainty that there were 2 of them," he said, pointing a finger at his friend. "Or are you going to dispute that fact as well?" "I was there," Coleman declared, "and I can confirm there were indeed 2 of them. However, they were less like Francis here and more along the size of Lily." She gave him a playful side eye. "Hey now," she said. "I may be small, but I'm feisty as fuck." "That's true," Ace cut in. "I've seen her put men 3 times her size in their place." Coleman raised his hands, palms out. "Oh, I believe it," he admitted. "Used to date a girl about her size, still have PTSD flashbacks from our fights, and a scar or 2. "Damn, Lil," Ace said, blinking at his cousin. "Sounds like you dated him too. You get around." She smirked. "Just so you know, cuz, I don't have to date a man to scar him for life," she drawled, and then gave him a very convincing crazy eyes, and he shrunk away from her. There was more laughter around the table, Coleman actually holding his gut with the force of it. Bailey entered the cafeteria, raising an eyebrow at the raucous episode playing out at the table. She slid in next to Francis and looked around. "Looks like I missed something," she quipped. "Not missing much, Mom," Terrell said, wiping pretend tears from his eyes. "Just swapping some horror stories about how women can absolutely destroy a man if they want to." "What about you, big fella?" Ace asked, resting his chin on his hand as he regarded Francis. "You worried about Bailey ripping you a new one if you step out of line?" The large man winked at him. "I don't step out of line," he replied, "so it's a non-issue." "Damn, girl, you got him trained already," Coleman declared, and chuckles rippled around the table. "I don't know. I'm not sure she has a killer inside of her," Dante said. "Well, that's just offensive," Lily said, playfully smacking him on the shoulder. "Why in the world would you say such a thing?" Dante shrugged. "I mean, I did pull her off of a perfectly good bridge, and she hasn't tried to stab me in my sleep," she said. "Pretty sure if I had done that to you, I'd have even more scars to deal with." Lily cocked her head. This is true," she admitted. "Told you. Feisty," Ace stage whispered. Terrell downed the rest of his coffee and set the mug down hard enough to get everyone's attention. "Okay, daylight's burning," he said. "We should get things rolling." "What are we doing today?" Ace asked, setting down his fork on his empty plate. Terrell leaned forward. "Today, we're getting us a safe house," he said. Bailey tensed. You don't think this place is safe enough?" she asked, chewing her bottom lip. "Don't worry, this place is plenty safe," the captain assured her. "Even more so with your man there keeping an eye out for you." He inclined his head to Francis, and Bailey looked up at the large man with a shy smile, her shoulders relaxing. "However, once we start making a move on the island, it could bring some trouble our way," Terrell continued. "Just trying to cover all our bases, that's all." Coleman snorted. "Good to see you learned the lesson from Operation Starstalker," he quipped. That's classified, Coleman, Terrell warned, pointing a finger at him. His friend raised his hand, counting off on his fingers. 1, no it's not, he shot back. 2, even if it was, nobody is here to enforce it. And 3, it's funny as hell. Terrell let out a defeated sigh, rubbing his forehead. Fine, you can tell it, he groaned. But only once we're on the road. Coleman grinned. Deal, he said brightly. So, where are we going? Dante asked, bringing the mission at hand back to the forefront of the conversation. Come on, I have a map set up, Terrell said, and got to his feet. If it's okay with you, Bailey piped up, I'm going to stay here and make some breakfast for my sisters. Of course, Terrell said with a smile, but if you'd be so kind as to let us borrow Francis there, we're going to need him today. She glanced at the large man with big, worried eyes, but he leaned down and softly kissed the top of her head. Don't worry about me. I'll be safe, he promised. She forced a smile up at him, and everyone got up from the table, following Terrell to the classroom just across the hall. When they entered, they spotted a 2-state map of Georgia and South Carolina hanging on the wall, with marks all over it. The territory that QXR had was blacked out, with markings on the bridges going into Savannah. To the northwest, across the river into Georgia, was a large circle. I may be off base here, Cap, Coleman drawled, motioning to the big circle, but I'm guessing that's where we're headed. Terrell nodded. Observant as always, he replied, standing next to the map and facing the ground. This is the tiny town of Springfield, Georgia. It's far enough away from Savannah that we shouldn't have to worry about a mob coming our way, but it's close enough to our current location that we can make it there in a pinch, even on foot. Jesus, that's what, 15, 20 miles? Ace asked, shaking his head. On foot? You've gone further for less, Lily drawled. Her cousin cocked his head at her, furrowing his brow. When? He demanded. Becky Weber, she replied simply. Ace hesitated a moment, and then turned back to Terrell. I withdraw the question, he said. I know it's small, but it still looks pretty big, Francis piped up, especially with a small group like us to clear it out. Don't worry, big fella, Dante said. We aren't clearing it out, we're just going in there for supplies. Lily shook her head. So, where's the safe house? She asked. Terrell motioned broadly around the town at what appeared to be a vacant land. Somewhere out here, he explained. Gotta be some farmhouses that we can take over. We'll just drive around until we find one. You think a farmhouse is going to be able to withstand an assault? Ace asked, skepticism in his tone. From a mob or, God forbid, QXR? If we get pushed out of here by QXR, we're not sticking around, Dante replied. We stay for a night before heading off to greener pastures. Ace crossed his arms. But where? He demanded. Anywhere those bastards aren't, Lily quipped. Her cousin nodded slowly. I can get behind that, he admitted. So, what's the plan, Cap? Coleman asked. 2 teams, Terrell replied. Coleman, you take a couple and find us a farmhouse. Start to the east and work counterclockwise around the town. My team will secure what we need to fortify and stock it up, as well as get what we need for a road trip, should it come to that. His friend nodded. Sounds like a fun day, he replied. Ace, Lily, you want to join me? Hell yeah, let's get geared up, Ace replied, raising a victory fist. Lily approached Terrell, pointing a finger directly into his face. We've already established that I'm feisty as fuck, she said in a menacing tone. If you don't want to find out for yourself, then you'd better take good care of my man. Understood? Yes, ma'am, Terrell replied, calm but sincere. I promise to bring him back in one piece. Okay, then, she said, and put her hands on her hips. Just wanted to make sure you knew you were on notice. She turned back to Dante, putting a soft hand on his chest. You watch yourself out there, she said quietly. He kissed her forehead and smiled. You too, hun, he said. Don't let those guys give you any shit. Trust me, Scarface, that's never been an issue with her, Ace declared from the doorway, and everyone chuckled as they headed out to get geared up for another big day. Chapter 2 Okay, that's good, Jackie, No Name said as he reset his knife in his hand. But what you want to do is follow through with that strike. You hit them in the right place on the head, and it'll punch right through. If you're off by a little bit, then you're going to need a little extra on it to get through. Jackie nodded, gripping her knife tightly. Okay, follow through, she chanted to herself, and then reset her stance in front of a practice dummy, with a 2x4 piece of wood on the side of the head. She struck again, putting everything she had into it, driving the knife a couple inches deep into the wood. Good job, No Name declared, as Kemp, Austin, and Grace applauded from the sidelines. Every time you strike, that's what I want you to do. Austin, come up here. Let's see what you got. As Austin approached him, there was a knock on the glass and everyone turned to the window to see Grayson, one of No Name's squad members. The bold mercenary motioned for him to come inside. Sorry to interrupt, Commander, Grayson said politely, but the boss wants to see you. No Name nodded, dread clenching in his gut. I'll be right there, he said. Grayson nodded and left, and the bold mercenary glanced over the group, landing on Kemp. Afraid that's going to have to do it for today, he said. Kemp cocked his head. Think we're heading out? He asked. More than likely, No Name replied with a nod. Get them back safely and assemble the crew. His subordinate sheathed his knife. Kenny? He asked. Definitely, No Name confirmed. Okay, we'll be in the staging area in 15, Kemp replied. Okay, guys, let's head back. Grace raised an eyebrow as she passed No Name, and he knew that look. That look asked if this was the day he'd get the ball rolling on a rescue. He simply nodded, his gaze responding that he was working on it. He left the gym and headed for the command center, walking straight through the room filled with activity and towards the small office where Theo Atkinson had taken residence. No Name knocked on the glass and his boss waved him in. You wanted to see me, sir? The bold mercenary asked as he entered. Yeah, come on in, Theo replied. Hope I didn't mess up your day. No Name shook his head. Just putting the civilian team through some training, he replied. Want to make sure they're ready to handle whatever we throw at them. I wouldn't put too much time into that, Theo replied, an ominous note to his tone. Don't have too many other off-island things that need doing. The bold mercenary fought to stay as casual as possible. Still, I like to be prepared, he said. And that's why you're my top man, Theo said, wagging a finger at him. Whatever situation comes up, I know you are prepared for it. No Name inclined his head at the compliment. So, how can I put my skills to use for you today? Straight to the point. I like it, his boss replied, and walked over to a map on the wall, pointing to a peninsula just to the north of Hilton Head Island, about a mile across the water. You familiar with Paris Island? Marine boot camp, No Name replied immediately. Didn't go there myself, but know quite a few guys who did. Theo nodded. It's one of the finest facilities in the U.S. military, he said wistfully. You getting inspired by my training of the civilians and want to open it back up? No Name asked, raising an eyebrow. His boss chuckled, shaking his head. Not exactly, he replied. With Beaufort mostly secure, I've been sending out some scouts to see what's in the neighborhood. One of them went there yesterday and found something worthy of our attention. Namely, a hell of a lot of military ordnance. I would have thought the military would have taken the guns and ammo when they were ordered to retreat, No Name replied, furrowing his brow. For the most part, they did, Theo explained. However, they left behind a fair amount of the heavy ordnance. Mortars, high explosives. Things that wouldn't be of much value fighting the enemy we're fighting. He clucked his tongue and raised a finger. They would be of immense value, however, to someone fighting us. Realization dawned on No Name, and he nodded slowly. And you think with Delta in the neighborhood they might put it together and make a play for it? He asked. It's definitely a possibility, Theo replied. The bold mercenary straightened his shoulders. So, what can I do? He asked. I want recon sweeps of the area to begin with, his boss said. Nothing meticulous, I want them moving quickly. Maybe we can get lucky and catch them off guard or away from their camp. No Name nodded. Okay, I already have my team assembling, he said. We'll get on this. Theo shook his head. No, have Kemp head up that mission, he instructed. I need you over at Paris Island. The bold mercenary's brow furrowed. Sir? He asked. We have to proceed like Delta will go after those munitions, Theo explained. I want you to go there and supervise the defensive setup. Of course, No Name agreed. But why not just move the ordnance to the full base? Theo smirked. Think of it as diversifying our portfolio, he drawled. This group has already hit our main base, so if they try that again, I want to make sure we have something in reserve. Understood, No Name replied with a nod. I'll brief Kemp on the situation, then head out. I have a helicopter waiting for you at the airport, his boss said. What's the situation on the ground? No Name asked. Secure, Theo replied. I had a team roll through this morning to finish off any stragglers. Marines did a good job of taking care of their sick before leaving, so it was spot cleaning. No Name nodded. Wish they had done that at the main base, he admitted. Would have saved a lot of lives. Doesn't it make you glad to be working with me instead of them? Theo asked with a smirk. This job does have its advantages, the bold mercenary said and turned towards the door. If you need anything, just call it in, Theo said when he reached for the knob. Yes, sir, No Name replied, and left the command center, heading immediately over to the staging area. So, what are we doing today, Commander? Kemp asked, stepping up beside their crew. Kenny stood off to the side, Levi, Wyatt, and Grayson were loading some weapons into the trunk of one of the vehicles, and Charlie stood scowling behind Kemp. Theo wants sweeps to resume, No Name replied. He wants to find Delta. Kemp shrugged. Gotta imagine they're dug in pretty good, he said. That's why he wants fast sweeps, the bold mercenary replied. Maybe get lucky and catch them poking their heads out. Charlie raised his chin. If they do, then I'll be happy to take 'em clean off, he boasted. No Name and Kemp rolled their eyes, but otherwise ignored him. So, where you want to hit first? Kemp asked. No Name shook his head. You're heading this one up, he said. Boss wants me over at Paris Island. Paris Island? His subordinate asked, brow furrowing in confusion. No Name nodded. Yep. Turns out they have some goodies they don't want Delta to get their hands on, he explained. Going there to set up defenses, probably be there through tomorrow. He shot Kemp a knowing look, and his friend grinned and glanced over his shoulder. Hey, Kenny, you ever seen that big-ass bridge into Savannah? He drawled. The football player shook his head. Can't say that I have, he replied. Well, today's your lucky day, Kemp declared, and motioned to No Name's SUV. Hop in. Kenny approached the vehicle and reached for the passenger door, but Charlie smacked a hand onto it and pointed to the back. Sorry, bud, he said with a sneer, but I got shotgun. Kemp raised an eyebrow. I want you with the others, he said. I bet you do, Charlie snapped. But I ain't letting you out of my sight again. Got a problem with it, and we can take it up with Theo. I'm sure he'd be real interested to hear why you don't want me riding along with you. Kemp and No Name exchanged a quick look, and then the former sighed. Levi, Grayson, Wyatt, Kemp said. Start up near Ridgeland and work your way south. We'll start at the bridge and work our way north. See y'all somewhere in the middle. Everyone got into their vehicles, and No Name lingered around the back of the SUV. As Kemp passed, he said quietly, Don't worry, Commander, I'll take care of it. No Name nodded and backed up as the vehicles peeled out. You better take care of it, he thought, because I don't think we're going to have another opportunity. Chapter 3. Coleman, Ace, and Lily drove behind Terrell and the others, taking a right turn several miles before they hit town. Go get 'em, boys, Coleman said quietly. Lily chewed her lip as she watched Dante's vehicle drive out of sight. Oh, don't worry, Lil, Ace drawled. Your man's a bona fide badass, and he's nowhere near as good as Coleman's man. And frankly, neither of them can hold a candle to Francis. They gon' be just fine. She sighed. I know, she said. I still worry, though. And just a point of order, so we're clear and all. Terrell is not my man, Coleman cut in. He's my commanding officer. Ace raised his palms. Hey now, I ain't one to make assumptions, and I also ain't one to kink shame, he drawled. Some people like to be bossed around. Be that as it may, not the situation here, Coleman said. All right, Ace said, a massive grin plastered across his face. Even though you appear to be protesting just a bit too much, I'll let it go. The soldier grunted. I swear to God I'll drive us right into a tree, he muttered. You'll have to forgive my cousin, Lily said. He's a moron. Coleman chuckled and Ace huffed, flopping back into his seat in the back. They drove on through the country, seeing nothing but vacant land. Can't imagine growing up around here, Coleman mused. Whole lot of nothing. Lily shrugged. You get used to it, she said. Drugs, alcohol, and satellite TV help a lot too, Ace added. Coleman laughed. Pretty sure that can be said about most situations, he said. Boy, you right about that, Ace agreed. A little ways down the road, Lily pointed out a driveway. Up there on the left, she said. Mailbox. All right, house number 1, Coleman declared, and made the turn onto a dirt road. It wasn't well maintained, and they bounced along as the vehicle bumped over the uneven gravel. Ace nearly hit the roof, not being buckled in. Ride 'em, cowboy, Lily cried with a laugh. Christ, man, little warning next time, the redneck whined. My bad, Coleman admitted, and glanced over at Lily in the passenger seat. They shared an amused smirk. The driveway was long, several hundred yards, and winding. Finally, after several bumpy turns, it began to open up into a clearing. As they drove in, all 3 of them let out a collective sigh. I'm no defense expert, Lily said slowly, but I don't think this one is going to work. They stared at what had once been a large 2-story wooden house, but was now mostly reduced to rubble due to a fire that had broken out some time ago. I tend to agree with your assessment, Coleman muttered. He put the vehicle into reverse, but Ace leaned forward, patting his shoulder. Wait a second, he said. Check out the door. There was a pile of bodies just inside the doorway. Coleman put the SUV in park and drew his handgun. Stay in the car, he instructed, and then walked up to the house. He listened carefully for sound, but didn't hear anything but the wind blowing gently. He moved closer, surveying the corpses. There were 6 of them, all charred to a crisp. He couldn't tell if they'd been alive or zombies when it had happened, but none of them were moving. He shook his head and walked back to the SUV, getting in and popping it into reverse to make the turn back to the driveway. So, what was it? Ace asked. Coleman shook his head. Don't know, but nothing good, he said and punched the gas. When they made it back to the road, they made the turn and headed along to search for the next driveway. After several miles, they still hadn't seen one. Guessing people in these parts don't get to know their neighbors, Coleman said. Only when the cows break loose and they have to track 'em down, Lily added. The soldier paused and then raised an eyebrow, turning to her. Wait, for real? He asked. Happens more than you think, she replied. He chuckled. Guess they gotta do something to entertain themselves when the drugs and alcohol wear off, he joked. Finally, they found another driveway, which, like the previous one, stretched on for quite a ways. Ace made sure to brace himself when they came off of the road, sparing him as bumpy of a ride. When they reached the house, they were collectively relieved to find it all in one piece. However, less relieved when they spotted several cars parked outside. Already doing better than the last one, Lily said dryly. Coleman nodded. Yeah, just gotta hope they were car collectors, he replied. As Lily emerged from the car, a few zombies staggered around the far side of the house. They looked pretty mangled, with multiple bite wounds and blood everywhere. One of them dragged a broken leg behind it. Coleman and I can handle them, Ace suggested as he and the soldier joined her outside. Why don't you check out the house? Lily put a hand on her hip, pursing her lips at him. Really? She asked. What? He asked, throwing up his hands. Just trying to be polite for once, damn. If you want to kill him so bad, you have at it. Lily rolled her eyes. No, you go have your fun, she drawled. I'll check the house. Ace and Coleman walked over to the ghouls, the former pulling out a machete and the latter a large knife. They moved about 5 yards apart, each of them managing to draw a creature in their direction. The one-on-one battles were easy for them to win, the zombies collapsing after a single strike each. "I like dealing with these assholes when it's just one at a time," Ace quipped. Coleman shook his head. "Enjoy it," he said, "because I doubt this kind of luck is the long-lasting kind." The two men walked back over to Lily, who was just standing by the front window and shaking her head, tapping her foot. "Something wrong, Lil?" Ace asked. She waved flippantly at the window. "Take a look for yourself," she said. The two men peered through the window and immediately recoiled in horror. The living room was a bloodbath, with a couple of corpses on the ground in pieces. The walls were splashed with crimson, with at least half a dozen ghouls slip and sliding around inside. "All right, so next house it is," Coleman muttered. Ace shrugged. "There ain't that many of them. We can handle it," he said. "Yeah, but do you want to hunker down in a house that has had corpses roaming around in it for a month?" Lily asked, wrinkling her nose. "It's gotta smell worse than your old place." The redneck contemplated for a few moments before nodding. "Yeah, you're not wrong," he admitted. "You know what they say," Coleman said brightly. "Third time's a charm." The trio begrudgingly headed back to the SUV, piling in and driving back out to the road, hoping that the next stop would prove a viable house for them to set up shop in. Chapter 4. Terrell stopped the SUV about half a mile short of civilization. In the distance, the group saw some small businesses lining the road, which led into what could be considered the heart of downtown. From the looks of it, the entire town was home to maybe a couple thousand people before it all ended, but was now home to hundreds of zombies, many of which were clearly visible. Some were in the streets, some around the buildings, and some moved freely in and out of open doors. As much as this looks like a one-stoplight town, I get the sense it goes on a little further than that, Dante said with a groan. Terrell nodded. "I'm thinking we take a side street and try to get around the bulk of these things," he suggested. "So, what all are we looking for here?" Dante asked. "Primarily food and guns," Terrell explained. "Gas is also high up there, but since the power's out, I'm not hopeful unless we can find a truck stop with an emergency generator. This being hurricane country and all, they gotta be prepared." "Too far off the interstate for that," Dante replied with a sigh. "So, food and guns it is. Francis, you ever been here?" The large man shook his head. "Can't say that I have," he replied. Terrell reached into his pocket, pulling out a small pair of binoculars. He looked up the road, trying to get a read on the businesses along either side of the street. "Well, the good news is that it doesn't look like there's a grocery store there," he said. "Not enough parking for it." Francis leaned forward. "And the bad news?" he asked. "With the way the things are looking," Terrell continued, "there's probably going to be a shitload of those things at the grocery store when we find it." Dante took a deep breath. "Well, let's go see," he said. The captain popped the SUV into drive and made the turn onto a small side road before the main downtown area. They drove for a bit before turning to the north, trying their best to flank the zombies in town and hoping that the grocery store was on the outskirts. The drive around town went quickly, but it wasn't encouraging. They looked over towards the town, spotting zombies roaming around the buildings and the fields. "I thought this place was small," Francis muttered. "Why are there so many of those things?" Dante shrugged. "Could be an escape point for people," he mused. "Trying to get out of Savannah when everything went bad. All it would take is one infected person turning into a runner to set off a chain reaction," Terrell added. Dante nodded. "That happened to us at the store," he said. "One second we're asking Bailey where the sodas are. Next second there are dozens of those things running around." "If that's the case here, then why don't we find another small town?" Francis asked. Terrell shook his head. "Because, realistically, any small town we're going to be able to reach on this side of the river is probably going to be like this," he explained. "Besides, we're resourceful. We can handle anything that comes our way," He turned onto the main road and headed up towards town. A block up, they spotted the grocery store straight ahead. Terrell hit the brakes and all of them stared in disbelief at the sight. "You were saying?" Francis asked dryly. There were about 200 zombies in the lot, all pressed up against the front door. Almost all of them were facing the building, however a few at the back roamed freely. None of them seemed to notice the SUV just yet. "So, about another town," Dante said slowly. "Now, we can do this," Terrell declared, and looked around the area. There was a small ice cream store building just across the street from the grocery store on the corner. There were only a couple of zombies around it, and he pointed to it. "There," he said. "You two get in there and lay low, and I'll pull the horde out of the way." Francis cocked his head. "How are you managing that?" he asked. "Spin this thing around, pop it in reverse, and hit the gas," Terrell replied. "Back end should be strong enough to withstand the hit, and with a little horn honking, we'll have a parade." Dante nodded thoughtfully. "That should clear them out pretty good," he said. "At least enough for us to get inside and get stocked up." "But what are you going to do?" Francis asked. "Neighborhood over there," Terrell replied, motioning across the way. "Just lead 'em in, circle the block, then come pick you boys up." "That's a tight window," Dante said, crossing his arms. The captain shrugged. "Better than fighting them all," he said. "This is true," Dante replied with a sigh. Francis reached to the seat beside him, pulled out his rugged chainmail gloves and slipping them on. Dante glanced back at him, and then shrugged. "This looks like the plan," he said. "You ready, big fella?" he asked. "Just try to keep up," Francis replied with a grin. The other men chuckled, and Dante grabbed his bat and checked his machete that was strapped to his leg. Terrell grabbed a walkie-talkie from the center console and handed it over to him. "Take this," he said. "When you're ready, just give me a shout." The duo got out and ran to the side of the road as Terrell did a 3-point turn to get into position. The ice cream shop was about 30 yards away, with 4 zombies moving around the front door. "Okay, we need to clear those 4 out and take cover," Dante said as they ran. "If any of them are still standing, they could pull those things our way." Francis smirked. "You just worry about getting us inside and clearing it," he said. "I'll handle them." Dante didn't argue with the man's look of determination, raising his fists tight in the metal gloves. "Lead the way, then," he said. Francis didn't wait, bursting forward and running through the grass a lot faster than Dante could have anticipated a man his size could. He picked up his own pace to catch up. Francis stayed in the grass as long as he could to dampen the noise of his footsteps. As he reached the parking lot, he came to a near-complete stop, slowly walking after that so that he didn't alert the zombies to his presence. He clinked his thumbs and fingers together upon approach, to garner the attention of just the ghouls by the door. They moaned softly and shambled towards him. Dante stopped a few yards behind the beastly man just as he lunged to go to town on the creatures. Francis grabbed the first one by its face, shoving his metal fingers into its eye sockets like a bowling ball. He pushed forward with such force that the rotting flesh tore, ripping the head clean off the body. He stepped forward to the next ghoul, using the severed head like a club and smashing it into the zombie's face. After several rapid-fire impacts in a row, both skulls were cracked open. He glanced back at Dante, who was just standing there, impressed. "You going to get the door, or what?" Francis asked, inclining his head to the ice cream shop. Dante snapped back to the mission, remembering he was on the clock. He headed for the building, keeping his footsteps quiet. The last 2 ghouls were by the window, pressed up against it and gnawing at the glass. Francis approached them, grabbing both shirt collars and jerking them back with great force. Once the corpses were on the ground, he lifted his giant boot and caved their skulls deep in quick succession. Dante pushed gently on the door, and he realized it was a double-swinging type, which put him on edge. Zombies could easily get in and out of such a thing. He gripped his bat tightly as he moved inside. As soon as he crossed the threshold, a set of arms reached for him from the side, and he backed into a defensive position, lowering to one knee. He forced the tip of the bat upwards into the gut of the zombie, sending it stumbling back. He got back to his feet, taking aim and swinging the bat as hard as he could, connecting with the side of its skull. The impact caved in the creature's head, dropping it to the floor. Before it even hit the floor, moans erupted from the other side of the small room. He turned and saw 2 more zombies coming his way, shoving tables and chairs as they pursued him. Dante readied his bat, moving over to the left so that the zombies lined up in a row rather than flanking him. He waited patiently as the first one grew close, bringing down a forceful vertical strike on it. He reset, waiting on the next one to get close enough, swinging and ending that one as well. Francis entered, gently shutting and securing the door behind him before immediately closing the curtains. "Good call," Dante said, and turned to help shut up the place. In a matter of moments, the room was darkened. They peered out through the side of the window, staying concealed. Relief flooded them when none of the grocery store mob seemed to be coming their way. Dante raised the walkie-talkie to his lips. "Terrell, we're good," he said quietly. "It's your show." "Stay tuned," the captain replied, "because it's going to be a good one." A moment later, tires squealed and they watched Terrell rocket past the building in reverse, headed straight for the mob. A few creatures near the back turned at the noise, only to be smacked in the face by the rear of the vehicle. The SUV bounced up and down a bit as it rolled over some zombies, and Terrell stopped a few yards short of the mob proper. He threw it into drive and laid on the horn, which turned most of the ghouls in his direction. He looked into the side mirror and grinned. "Oh yeah, we're in business now," he bellowed, and then pressed lightly on the gas to lead the horde away from the store. He picked up the radio. "Easy as pie," he said into the receiver. "Give it about 10 minutes and you should have a clear path." "Just don't get too far out there," Dante came back. "This isn't going to be a long shopping trip." "When you're ready, I'll come a-running," Terrell promised. "Good luck." Chapter 5. 15 minutes later, Dante and Francis stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot. There were a few stragglers with busted limbs attempting to shamble after the horde, but the most concerning thing were the ones left by the front entrance. There were still about a dozen or so ghouls hanging around the front of the store. It was difficult for the duo to see from their position 70 yards away, but it appeared as though the front sliding doors were wide open. "You have done more of these than I have," Francis said gruffly. "What are you thinking?" Dante took a deep breath. "We have to assume that the front door is wide open and we're not going to be able to shut it," he said. "Those automatic doors are flimsy as hell, so we're going to have to come up with something else." "Shopping carts?" Francis suggested. "Could work," Dante mused. "They're usually stacked up by the front door. If we wheel enough of them over, it should buy us time." Francis inclined his head towards the parking lot. "What about the crowd?" he asked. "We start making noise when we're in the parking lot, then push right through them," Dante suggested. "If we need to take them out, we can hit them on the line." The larger man nodded. "Plus, Terrell has guns, so he can pick them off too," he said. "I'm more concerned about what's going on inside the store if the doors are open." "Me too, big fella," Dante replied with a sigh. "I say we get in, secure the front with the carts, and start sweeping." Francis nodded thoughtfully. "And if we get overwhelmed?" he asked. "Head for some high ground and hope that the SUV has enough power to punch through a row of shopping carts," Dante replied with a grim smile. "Sounds like fun," Francis quipped. "You ready to get to it?" Dante raised an eyebrow. "If I said no, would it matter?" he asked. Francis chuckled. "Probably not," he said. The duo approached the door, opening it up and peering out. There were a few stragglers between them and the grocery store. "I go right, you go left," Dante said. Francis nodded. "I'm good with that," he said. Dante tossed open the door and they burst out, racing towards the staggered zombies who were immediately excited at the sight of them. Both men delivered violent strikes with metal fists and a baseball bat without even breaking stride as they ran towards the store. When they reached the parking lot, Dante dragged his metallic bat behind him. It clanged loudly on the pavement, bouncing up and down rapidly. The noise began to pull zombies away from the front of the store and head in their direction. They stayed fairly bunched up with 4 or 5 in small groups with a tiny gap between them. "Go through the middle," Dante yelled. Francis picked up the pace, Dante falling in line behind him, and they ran full speed towards the ghouls. Francis lowered his shoulder and slammed into the weak spot of the two converging groups. The impact of the giant man sent several zombies flying, clearing the path for them. As soon as they cleared them, another problem arose, with 4 zombies showing up in front of the door from the inside, with only 15 yards to go and no turning back. Dante raised his bat. "I'll take him," he bellowed. "You get the carts." Francis slowed up a bit to let Dante take the lead, and they crossed the threshold. Dante leapt up and delivered a forceful knee strike to the lead ghoul's chest, sending it stumbling back. He didn't break stride, instead leaping over the downed zombie and swinging his bat, catching the next one in the side of the head. He used his momentum to spin around, cracking the downed ghoul in the face as well. Dante turned back towards the other 2 approaching zombies, ready to attack, but looked past them. There were a dozen more coming out of the aisles, attracted by the noise. With a few yards between him and the 2 closest corpses, he turned back to Francis. The large man was at the back of a long line of shopping carts, pushing with everything he had. It took a moment for the mass of rolling metal to get going, but finally it did. He pushed hard, picking up a lot of steam and slamming it into the wall to completely block off the door. "We got trouble!" Dante cried, and swung again, smashing in a rotted face before stepping up to finish off the last corpse nearby. The dozen or so coming out from the aisles were still about 15 yards away, and most of them had to deal with the checkout lines, which bought them a few precious moments. Francis approached, cracking his neck. "Open to suggestions," Dante said quickly. The large man shrugged. "I knock 'em down, you finish 'em off," he said. Dante raised his bat and nodded. "Lead the way, my good man," he said. Francis focused his attention on the creatures in the main aisle, 4 of them coming their way. The large man didn't run, simply casually walked up to the leader, grabbing the creature by the shirt and lifting it off of his feet. The zombie flailed about, trying to grab onto its attacking meal, but Francis paid it no attention, as he used the creature like a battering ram, smacking into the rest and knocking them all to the floor. He stepped over the fallen creatures, and Dante executed them one by one in his wake with precise baseball bat strikes to the face. With the group in the open area subdued, Francis spun the zombie around, pile-driving it into the floor with a sickening crunch. There were about 7 corpses having issues dealing with the checkout lines. The 2 men moved up the aisle, each of them taking turns dispatching an enemy. Francis grabbed one and shoved its head onto the metal checkout line, cracking its skull like a coconut on the railing. Dante swung his bat down, breaking the neck of the next creature. They moved down the line, one after the other, until the front of the store was clear. They took a momentary breather as they listened for more zombies, hearing some moaning coming from the back. It was dimly lit, with only the front entrance and the skylights providing a bit of illumination. "I'll do a head count if you want to double-check the front door," Dante suggested. Francis nodded and headed off for the front entrance. The shopping cart line held well, with about a dozen creatures pressed up against it. Despite their weight, they thankfully weren't moving the carts. Dante meanwhile walked to the far end of the store, looking down the first aisle and seeing nothing. He started walking, checking each aisle for trouble. Most of them were empty, but a few had 1 or 2 ghouls ambling up. He kept a mental count of how many, and when he got back to the last aisle, he did some quick math. 10 more of those things in here, pretty spread out too, he called. Francis nodded. "Let's clear them out and go shopping," he said. The 2 men shared a fist bump before heading out into the store to finish clearing it out. Chapter 6. 10 minutes later. Dante and Francis pushed a few shopping carts along the aisle, throwing on bottled water, ramen noodles, batteries, and other non-perishable goods. Dante grabbed one more case of bottled water and shoved it on the bottom of the cart. "I think that'll do it, unless you can think of something," he asked. Francis pursed his lips for a moment. "Beer?" he suggested. "I mean, if we're coming all this way, might as well make it worthwhile. And frankly, if we're going to be driven out of our home and into a safe house, we're probably going to need a drink, or 6. Dante agreed. He pulled out his walkie-talkie. "Terrell, you copy?" he asked. "Y'all got the shopping done?" The captain came back immediately. Dante nodded. "Yeah, we just gotta grab one more thing and we'll be ready to go," he said. How's the front looking? Terrell asked. Dante looked over the line of excited zombies. About a dozen or so, he replied, but we'll have them cleared out by the time you get here. How are you looking? Rolling around the neighborhood, Terrell said. A bunch of those things are hanging out by the entrance, so they'll be following me back to the store. But we should have plenty of time to load up and go. Dante nodded again. All right, we'll be ready, he said. Terrell tossed down his walkie-talkie and checked his surroundings. Behind him were 100 or so zombies trailing him like the Pied Piper. The road ahead of him was clear, but he was about to circle back to the single road entrance. As he made the turn to go back, there were about 80 zombies still around there, mostly blocking the road. Several of them were hung up on bushes, creating a lot of noise and keeping the others nearby as a result. He gently pet the steering wheel like it was a puppy. Okay, girl, you can do this, he cooed. Just punch right through them and get to the grocery store. Then we're on the road home. You got this. With his pep talk complete, he hit the gas, picking up a lot of speed as he approached the mob. The roaring engine attracted their attention, pulling them away from the pack towards them and thinning them out a bit. He veered to the right, hoping to avoid the thickest patches, but still had to crash through a couple dozen. Creatures bounced off of the front end, flying every which way. He bounced up and down as the SUV rolled over corpses. Come on, come on, come on, he urged and floored it, plowing through the last few creatures and hitting the main road. The windshield was cracked and a bit bloody, but the SUV picked up speed, getting away from the mob. Hell yeah, he bellowed. Terrell looked in the rearview mirror, seeing the mob break away from the entrance to follow him. It was a couple 100 yards to the front of the store, which gave them several minutes to get shit done. As he approached the front of the store, Dante and Francis were picking off a last few zombies against a line of shopping carts. Terrell pulled up directly in front of the store and hopped out, quickly grabbing some ghouls on the ground and dragging them out of the way as Francis pushed the carts back to clear a path to bring the goods out. How'd it go? Terrell asked. Dante shrugged. Just another day of breaking skulls, he quipped. Francis rolled out a couple of carts and Dante and Terrell grabbed them, tossing goods into the back of the SUV. As they finished one, they shoved it aside and started loading up the next. As they worked, Dante realized the SUV was sinking down on the back right side. He was confused for a moment, brow furrowing, and then his heart skipped a beat and he knelt down. The back right tire was quickly losing air. Oh shit, he said. What is it? Terrell demanded, frantically looking around. Dante shook his head and pointed to the tire. We got a problem, he said. Terrell took a knee and then threw his hands up. What the hell? He cried and inspected it further, finally finding the culprit. There was a large piece of jagged bone sticking out of the rubber. It was losing air so quickly he could actually see the tire deflating. Dante looked back towards the road at the couple 100 zombie-strong mob coming their way. We got maybe 5 minutes until they're on us, he warned. Terrell frantically began moving goods around in the truck so he could get to the spare tire and jack. After several moments, he finally yanked the tire out, giving it a good thump to make sure it was full of air. Francis came out of the store with the final 2 carts of goods, brow furrowing at the situation. What do we do? He asked. Can we drive on it? Not very far, Terrell replied and shook his head. Pretty good chance we wouldn't have enough to punch through them. He rolled the spare over to Francis and then pulled the jack out. We gotta change it, and change it quick. Dante stared at the mob. How much time do you need? He asked. 15, maybe 20 minutes, Terrell replied. Dante wrinkled his nose, continuing to stare and nodding slowly. Dante, the captain said, not liking the thoughtful look in his companion's eye. I'll get you your 20 minutes, Dante said firmly. You just be ready to come pick me up. Terrell put a hand to his forehead. If you care anything about my well-being, you won't get yourself eaten, he warned. I don't want to face off with Lily. Dante snorted. Wouldn't be much of a face-off, he quipped, and held up the walkie-talkie. Be waiting on my call. He shoved it back in his pocket at Terrell's nod and then ran towards the mob. When he reached the road, he slammed the bat down on the ground hard, sending a loud metallic clang echoing through the air. Come get some, he yelled. Fresh meat, boys and girls. First come, first serve. He continued to hammer the bat into the ground while walking backwards up the road. He continually glanced over his shoulder to make sure he wasn't being flanked. As he backed up, he noticed that the majority of the zombie mob was coming his way. He thought hard for a moment. "Okay, Dante, you got them to follow you," he muttered. "Now what?" He turned around, looking down the street at some small buildings a quarter-mile away. There were a few ghouls around it that had begun shambling his way. He grinned, shaking his head, and continued walking towards them. He dragged his bat behind him to continue a scraping metallic noise and keep the horde's attention. As he walked at a good clip, he looked at his timer. 4 minutes. 16 to go, he said with a sigh. The zombies ahead grew in number, now reaching 9, but still spread out fairly well. When he was within 20 yards of them, he sped up, darting in and out between them. Halfway through, he was forced to swing, hitting a ghoul in the face and sending it tumbling backwards. He darted around the rest of them, hearing a loud crash from his right. The front window of a store busted out beneath the weight of a dozen zombies inside. "So much for taking refuge," he muttered, and continued moving forward as the mob behind him continued to grow. He didn't get much further up the road before he spotted another larger group coming out from a street up ahead. Dozens of ghouls. Dante paused in the middle of the road, looking around, unsure of where to go next. There were houses about 50 yards to his left across an open field, movement there that he could see. He looked ahead and back. Packs of zombies in both directions. "Only choice I got," he muttered, and checked his timer. 10 minutes. Dante cut to the side, perpendicular to the road, and tore into the grass. He cut across the field into the neighborhood, keeping his ears strained to make sure the zombies weren't gaining on him. Thankfully, they were slow and noisy, so he could keep tabs while focusing on his run. When he reached the neighborhood street, his stomach sank. There were zombies everywhere, and they were all drawn to him, closing in quicker than comfortable. He took an opening to the left, lowering his shoulder to barrel through a pair of ghouls and tear up to the front porch of a house. There was no time to check it, so he drew his knife and turned the handle, thanking his lucky stars that it was open. He slammed the door behind him, and immediately something soft and fleshy slammed into his side, snarling and snapping. He reacted fast, shoving back as hard as he could, and then barreled to the back door. The backyard of the house was full of ghouls not fenced in, and he cursed under his breath. He ran back up the hallway just as the zombie by the door staggered to its knees. He stabbed it in the head just as the front door rattled and creaked. He clenched his jaw. That door wasn't going to hold for very long. There was no deadbolt, only a twist lock on the handle, and it wouldn't be long before the horde's strength could bust it down. He darted into the living room, finding 2 ghouls on the other side of a large sectional couch. He leapt for the window, peering out into the space between the 2 houses, seeing no movement. He attempted to open it and then grunted when it wouldn't budge. He looked above the lower pane and found the lock, flicking it open and dragging the window frame up. The moans inside got closer, and he could nearly feel the putrid breath on the back of his neck as he kicked out the screen and dove outside into the grass. He hit the ground hard, but shook it off and leapt to his feet. The front door caved in, and ghouls poured into the house. He crept to the back corner of the house, hoping to find an opening in the backyard mob to get through. The clamoring inside of the house seemed to keep the horde's attention, and he waited as long as he dared before tearing in the opposite direction, along the backs of the houses. A few buildings down, he skidded in the grass as a pack of a few dozen ghouls staggered around the corner of the house at the end of the row. "Not my damn day," he muttered, and glanced between the 2 houses to his right. On the far side, even more zombies wandered by, so the front was out of the question. Making a snap decision, he tore up the back steps of the closest house and tried the back door. He readied his knife, this time taking a breath before entering, ready for an attack. Nothing immediately jumped out at him, so he locked the door and pulled the blind shut, hoping to deter any of the wandering zombies in the back from attempting to get inside. He listened carefully as he strode to the front door to secure it, hearing a thumping upstairs but nothing on the main floor. He shook his head and peered carefully out the front peephole. There weren't any zombies too close to the house, but they were still pouring down the street in a river of death. He looked down, relief washing over him that this door seemed sturdier and actually had a deadbolt for him to throw. "I'll just wait this out. Hopefully they'll all go to that other house and I can just sneak out," he thought. There was a crash from upstairs after more thumps, and his heart raced at a shadow in the living room. He ran over to the window there and spotted a zombie next to the house with glass sticking out of its face. "Did you just bust out of the upstairs bedroom?" Dante breathed, and then his chest clenched when he noticed ghouls approaching from the front window. They'd heard the glass shatter and had redirected to the house. Shit. He drew all of the curtains, but the ghouls that had seen him come in the back had already reached the back of the house. Bangs and wet thumps echoed from the rear of the house, and he peeked out the front, stomach sinking at the zombies converging in the front yard. They reached the front door and thrashed against it, but at least both were holding. He sighed and backed away from the window, sitting down on the stairs and pulling out his walkie-talkie. "Hey, Terrell," he said into the device. Chapter 7. Terrell worked at the tire as Francis punched down straggler zombies behind him. There weren't many corpses coming around. Dante's plan had brought them a safe space and amount of time. "Those are some badass gloves there, big fella," Terrell said as he hefted the spare tire into place. Francis puffed out his chest a bit. "Bailey made them for me," he declared. "Works like a charm against these things." "Think she can whip me up a set?" Terrell asked as he began twirling the nuts on. Francis shrugged as he pulverized the skull of an approaching ghoul. "Worst she can do is say no," he replied. As Terrell put the last nut on and reached for the tire iron, his radio came to life. "Hey, Terrell, come in," Dante said. The captain grabbed his radio and raised it to his lips. "You hanging in there, man?" he asked. "I'm going to need some serious help getting out of this one," Dante admitted. Terrell nodded. "Need a couple more minutes on the tire, and we'll be on the way to pick you up," he replied. "Don't think you understand," Dante said firmly. "Going to need more than just the two of you if I'm getting out of this one." Terrell shook his head. "Damn, man, can't leave you alone for 2 minutes unsupervised, can I?" he asked with a chuckle. "Yeah, well, you can ground me after you get me out of here," Dante said dryly. The captain took a deep breath. "Where are you?" he asked. "Some neighborhood just to the north of you," came the reply. "Maybe a half a mile down the road?" Terrell nodded. "We'll call in reinforcements," he assured him. "Hang tight, we'll get you out." Francis brought his fists together on either side of a zombie's head, crushing it into an hourglass shape. Terrell tightened the nuts on the tire with the iron, and then stood up, tossing the tool back into the truck and pulling out his walkie-talkie. "Coleman, where you at?" he asked. When the line went live, there was grunting with screams in the background. "Just dealing with an issue," came the reply. Terrell's brow furrowed. "You good?" he asked. "We'll manage," Coleman said, more gunfire peppering the line. "What's up?" The captain took a deep breath. "Dante got himself in trouble," he said. "Need you on the south side of town. Meet up at the grocery store." "Gonna be a few minutes, but we'll get there," Coleman promised with another grunt. "Hurry it up," Terrell said, and then shoved the radio back into his pocket. Francis obliterated a final zombie skull and turned towards the captain. "Sounds like they're having a rough day," he said. Terrell shrugged. "Who isn't?" Chapter 8. "Die, motherfucker, die!" Ace bellowed, stabbing a zombie in the face. Lily slashed at flailing arms, trying to get through the door while she pressed her weight against it as her cousin played stab-a-mole with the ghouls. Coleman, meanwhile, kicked a zombie in the chest by the living room window, knocking it back and using the precious seconds to shoot its friend in the forehead. He lunged down with his knife, planting it into the first ghoul's head, and then popping back up. He rushed to the door where Ace took down the last moving body that was pressed against the outside of it. "Let go, Lil," he said, and she eased up, the door swinging open under the weight of the finally still corpses piled against it. The farmhouse they'd found and surrounding area had been a little more infested than they'd thought at first glance. "Third time's the charm," he said. Lily muttered as a loud bang sounded at the back of the house. "Kitchen door," Coleman snapped, scrambling over the pile of bodies. The others followed, and they reached the linoleum just in time to see half a dozen ghouls pour in through the back door. They bunched up at the island, and the living trio got to work before the ghouls figured out how to get around it. Coleman planted himself in the center, stabbing forward with his machete over the countertop, and Lily and Ace each took a side, dodging arms to stab at the zombies on the side. Ace grunted as a creature managed to get a hold of his wrist, and he flailed, flinging himself to the side to drag the zombie across the island. Coleman staggered a second and then stabbed down into the ghoul's head, giving Ace the ability to pry the cold, dead fingers from his arm. Lily grabbed a long-handled frying pan from a hanger next to the stove and swung hard, the metallic bong echoing in the small space and sending a ghoul flipping backwards. A zombie from behind it staggered past its fallen friend, and she stabbed it in the face before taking care of the one on the floor. "Check outside," Coleman said, rushing back towards the front of the house. Ace jumped over the pile, peering outside into the back. He leapt back immediately as a creature flopped in front of him and attempted to slam the door. Another ghoul jammed its hand into the gap, and Lily launched herself into the door to try to hold it shut against the onslaught of weight suddenly on the other side. "Where did they come from?" she yelled. "Second wave, I guess," Ace grunted, stabbing wildly at the arms curling through to get to them. "Coleman!" Lily screamed as her shoes began to slide along the linoleum. "This ain't gonna hold," her cousin cried as he tried to brace himself on the island and push against the door, unable to attack any longer. The soldier reappeared in the hallway opening and raised his rifle. "On three, run away from the door and stay low," he commanded, and both rednecks nodded. 1, 2, 3. Lily and Ace each took off like a shot, one in each direction around the island, keeping their heads low as the door slammed open. Coleman opened fire and managed to take out quite a few, at least enough so that his friends could scramble away, but the tide still flowed in. It boggled him where they were even coming from. There must have been a horde in the surrounding trees that had filtered out from the noise. "Lil!" Ace cried, darting behind a large couch in the living room. "Help me with this!" His cousin caught what he was getting at, and she grabbed the closer end of the furniture, gripping the arm and jerking on it. They heaved and dragged together, realizing quickly that the couch was one of those heavy pullouts full of metal. Coleman continued to fire until he spotted what they were doing, and then backed up in the hallway, aiming into the kitchen and attempting to at least keep the zombies behind the island so they could get the couch in place. Once Lily was clear, Coleman dropped his gun and shoved against the couch, making sure it was flush across the hallway to keep the ghouls in the kitchen. He drew his knife, and as the first zombie threw itself at his face, he stabbed it in the forehead and shoved it back into its friends. Zombies quickly filled the kitchen, but the trio went to work at what they did best. They were sweaty and intense. The scent in the house quickly became near unbearable, but it had to be done. If they'd have known the area was this overrun in the first place, they might have passed it by. But at this point, they'd come this far and were stuck in the battle, which meant finishing it. And after all this work, might as well get a safe house out of it. Lily jerked her arm back as a zombie almost got a hold of it, and the creature flopped forward, flipping over the back of the couch and onto the cushion. Coleman bent and plunged his knife into the back of its head, but as he straightened back up, another zombie caught a hold of his bicep. Ace slashed down with his knife, severing the arm at the elbow, and then stabbed the ghoul in the face, sending it back into the crowded kitchen. Coleman shook off the severed limb, giving the redneck a nod of thanks, and they went back to business. Soon all that was left was the sound of their heavy breaths and the stench of rot and death. "Okay," Ace huffed. "That should be it now, right? It's gotta be." Coleman grabbed his rifle and hopped the couch, stepping across the squishy bodies to the back door. He raised the barrel and peeked outside, moving slowly in case something jumped out. But thankfully, nothing did. He did a sweep of the yard, stepping out and peering into the trees. He listened hard, straining his ears, but there were no more moans or bangs or anything out there. "Clear!" he called as he turned back towards the kitchen. He was about to clamber back inside and then gazed distastefully at the corpses littering the room. "I'll sweep around the outside and meet you at the front." He pulled the back door shut tight, giving it a push to make sure it was latched well. Lily gave him a thumbs up and took a deep breath, turning towards the front door. Ace wrinkled his nose as he looked at the piles of bodies they'd dispatched. "Do we really want to call this place home?" he asked, motioning wildly. "It's gonna stink to high heavens." "Depends. Do you want to clear out another house like this one?" Lily asked, raising an eyebrow. Her cousin glanced back at the corpses and shook his head emphatically. "I think we can make this work," he said. "Crack a window or something, let it air out." "Good call, cuz," she declared, clapping him on the shoulder. "Let's make sure everything is secured and get this place locked up tight," Coleman said as he entered through the front door. He entered the living room to close the window he'd been using to take out zombies in the yard. Ace cocked his head. "What about clearing the corpses?" he asked. The soldier shook his head. "Going to have to wait," he said. "Dante is in a bit of a pickle." Lily's eyes widened. "Dante's in trouble?" she demanded. "What the hell are we waiting around for?" Coleman raised his hands. "It's okay, he's safe," he assured her. "He just needs our help to make sure he stays that way." She growled and marched towards the front door, quick and determined. When she realized they weren't following her, she whirled around, fire in her eyes. "Don't make me ask you to get moving," she roared. Coleman and Ace shared a glance as she burst out of the house, and then rushed after her, neither of them wanting to be the last one to follow her orders. Chapter 9. Coleman pulled up to the grocery store, seeing a trail of dead bodies and a handful of zombies still roaming about, but no Terrell. He pulled out his walkie-talkie. "Hey, Cap," he said. "We're here. Don't see you, though." "There's a road to the left of the store," Terrell came back. "Come up it a few blocks and you'll see us." Coleman nodded, setting the radio in his lap and driving up the road, avoiding the ghouls so they didn't have any vehicular problems. A few of the stragglers attempted to follow, but he left them in the dust quickly. When they reached Terrell, he was standing in the front yard of a house looking through the scope of his rifle towards a neighborhood. Francis stood behind him, metal-covered fists at the ready, making sure nothing snuck up on them. As soon as Coleman stopped the car, Lily dove out and made a beeline towards the captain, every muscle in her body tight as a drum. Terrell lowered his rifle at the sound of her stomping and raised a hand at the look of her fiery eyes and clenched jaw. "We'll get him back unharmed," he promised. "Please don't cut me." She took in a deep, ragged breath, composing herself as best she could. "What's going on?" she managed to ask, though there was the tremble of unbridled anger and worry in her tone. Terrell held out the rifle and pointed down the street. She lifted it and looked through, chest constricting with fear at the sight of 100 or so zombies surrounding a house. "How the hell did you let him get into that position?" she snapped, lowering the gun and glaring at the captain. "We had a flat tire from running those things over," Terrell explained quickly, "and the mob of those things were headed our way. Didn't have time to debate it, he just bolted and drew them away from us." She gritted her teeth. "Of course he did," she muttered, and then took a deep breath. "So what's the plan?" she demanded. Terrell winced, raising an eyebrow, and she glared at his lack of an answer. "We'll get one, don't worry," he promised. "How's it look?" Coleman asked as he and Ace approached. "He's surrounded," Lily snapped. Terrell cocked his head helplessly. "Ideas?" he asked. Coleman took the rifle from her and peered through it at the situation, letting out a low whistle. "That looks like fun," he said, sarcasm evident in his tone. "Hit and run might work. One vehicle leads them away, and the other does pickup," Terrell asked. Coleman nodded and shrugged. "Heard worse ideas," he admitted. "Wait," Lily said firmly. "What?" Coleman asked, shaking his head. "It's a good plan." "How's the rest of the neighborhood look?" she asked, crossing her arms. "You've already blown one tire today. Not sure you want to risk another one?" Terrell nodded thoughtfully. "Okay, Coleman, you're on pickup duty," he said. "Francis and I will take the long way around, making sure we don't have trouble." Coleman raised a victory fist. "Let me know when you're ready to go," he said. "Will do," the captain replied. "Once we get him out, we rendezvous a mile down the road from the grocery store, away from town." Terrell led Francis to the SUV, the captain in the driver's seat, and backed up slowly to explore the neighborhood. They went back several blocks and upon rounding a corner encountered a mini-mob of zombies staggering around the middle of the road. They looked aimless at first, but they slowly turned to face the idling vehicle. "Drive-by stabbing?" Terrell suggested. Francis tapped his gloves together. "Drive-by punching," he corrected. The captain chuckled and popped the SUV into gear, moving forward inch by inch. They unrolled their windows and he readied his knife while Francis hung out the window from the waist up. The zombies weren't too clustered together, which was a blessing, making it easy for them to safely clobber them one by one. Terrell maneuvered the car so that he wasn't running any of them over at this point. He was paranoid of causing any vehicle damage. At the slow speed, he managed to bump them out of the way, carving a path through the mini-horde. His aim was true with his left hand, stabbing into eye sockets and foreheads with expert grace. When they came out the other side, he pulled a U-turn, and they went back the other way, repeating the process again. They idled in the middle of the road as a few straggler ghouls wandered towards them from the sides, and as they approached the duo took them out unscathed. Terrell sped down the rest of the block, driving around to the far side of the house. He turned the car around so that the trunk faced the horde, and then laid on the horn. Francis leaned out the window and fired a few times into the mob, taking down a few in the back and alerting as many ghouls as possible. "Hit it!" he called, and Terrell eased on the gas, moving forward like the Pied Piper of Death. Ace, Lily, and Coleman watched as Terrell and Francis drew away about 2/3 of the mob trapping Dante. "Let's move," Coleman said, and Ace hit the gas. Lily stayed on foot, hanging back to wait for an opening to create a path for Dante. "Heading up to the house," Coleman said into the walkie-talkie, and there was a crackle as the line clicked on. "I'm ready," Dante replied. "We're going to try to pull as many as we can away from the house, but we won't be firing guns," the soldier continued. "We don't want to draw back any of the pack that followed the others." 10-4, Dante agreed. Ace pulled up behind the ghouls, smacking into the front of the house, resisting the urge to honk the horn to get their attention. The engine seemed to do the trick, and most of them turned, slapping the windows and excitedly approaching the vehicle. He moved slowly, turning to avoid running over any corpses, despite how much he wanted to. They didn't need any more busted vehicles on their hands. He idled down the street a bit, cursing under his breath at how many had stayed behind at the house. Ace stiffened as he watched Lily in the rearview mirror, darting closer to the mob, still smacking the house all by herself. "Shit, Lil," he cried, whipping around in his seat. "What's she doing? She should be waiting for us." Coleman shook his head. "She's got rock-solid balls, that one," he muttered, and drew his knife. The vehicle was surrounded by ghouls, but if they were strategic, they'd be able to fight their way out and get to Dante. "Terrell, come back," Coleman said into the radio. "How's it going over there?" the captain asked. "We might have to go weapons hot," Coleman replied. "You guys able to keep your mob occupied so they don't head back to flank us?" "I think we can handle that," Terrell replied. "Thanks for the heads up. Be safe." Coleman nodded and shoved the radio back into his pocket, glancing at Ace. "If you keep moving, I'll get on the roof and try to carve myself out a path to get back to the house. You might have to make some noise to keep them focused on you." The redneck nodded like a bobblehead. "I got this. You just make sure my cousin doesn't get her face eaten off," he said. "Deal," Coleman replied, and opened the sunroof. He popped out, knife in one hand and gun in the other, and Ace started to crawl down the street. As soon as he started moving, the soldier braced himself and waited to see if the ghouls would naturally flow around the back so he could slide down the front. Thankfully, they did, but quite a few of them were focused on the fresh meal poking out of the top of the car. He waited until the mob was halfway down the car before clambering up onto the roof. This agitated the zombies, and they reached for him, maniacally staggering after the vehicle with their mouths open in loud snarls. He turned towards the front and deftly slid down the hood. This didn't go unnoticed by the mob, and even though he darted quickly to the side of the street, a good number of them peeled off from the group to follow him. He lashed out and stabbed one in the face, whipping around to kick another one back towards the car. He took off across the grass and Ace honked, speeding up a little bit and drawing the ghouls surrounding him up the road. Lily's heart pounded. Dante was in that house, surrounded by zombies. Her man was in there, and it was her job to get him out. As Ace and Coleman slowly drove away, it became clear that they weren't going to draw all of the monsters away. She was going to have to take matters into her own hands. Or, well, her own blade. Once the car was a safe distance away, the mob they'd pulled sufficiently distracted, she moved up from her spot. She knew she'd have to be strategic and quiet, and take them out from the back without being noticed. She'd never done it on her own, but she'd done it with the others and seen it done, and it was the only way now. Lily crept forward, sneaking up behind a zombie right at the back of the mob, and stabbed it in the back of the head. She leapt back as it crumpled in the grass, bracing herself for one of its friends to turn on her, but none did. She repeated the process, but this time as the zombie fell, two next to it turned and spotted her. She darted to the side, avoiding the outstretched arms of the closest one, dancing away to safety. The sound of shattering glass cut through the air and her heart skipped a beat. What the hell was that? Images flashed through her panicked mind of zombies busting into the house and swarming Dante. But there were no broken windows out front. But the back. She snapped out of her reverie just in time to leap away from the approaching zombies, lashing out to stab the closest one in the forehead. She kicked it in the belly with her foot to wrench the body free of her blade, and then whirled, smacking away the second zombie's arm to stab it in the eye socket. As it fell, more zombies turned towards her, and she spotted a blur out of the corner of her eye. She glanced over to see Coleman. Having liberated himself from the car Ace was still driving. "I think they busted in the back of the house," she called, walking backwards as more zombies peeled away from the house. "You need to help Dante." She put two fingers in her mouth and let out a sharp whistle, still walking backwards to keep out of reach of the pack. A few stayed behind, but most moved towards her, and though it was a terrifying sight, it was comforting to know that at least she'd opened Dante a path. Coleman watched helplessly as Lily whistled, drawing the attention of the ghouls outside the house. He considered opening fire to try to take them out before they could get to her, but drawing them back in his direction would destroy any semblance of effectiveness for her plan. She'd made a quick, dangerous decision, but she'd made it, and now that it was done, he had to go with it if they wanted to get Dante out of that house. All he could do was hope that Lily was as badass as she seemed. With only 4 ghouls left at the front door of the house, he darted in and took out 2 in quick succession from behind. The others turned towards him, and he kicked one in the chest, holding it against the door with his foot, while he stabbed the other one in the face. The one he held managed to grab a hold of his ankle, and Coleman flailed his leg. He couldn't disengage, so he flung himself backwards, attempting to wrench himself free. He toppled onto the grass on his back, his attacker landing on top of him, and braced its neck with his forearm to keep its gnashing teeth away from his face. He finally managed to stab it in the side of the head, and then heaved the limp body off of him before anything else could descend onto him. Thankfully, there was nothing else, only the backs of the 2 packs, one following Ace and the other following Lily. What was most concerning, however, was the fact that Dante hadn't come out the front door as soon as it was clear. Coleman took a deep breath, shaking his head as he sheathed his knife and raised his gun. "You'd better be alive, or that woman is going to kill me," he muttered, and grabbed the doorknob. Dante shoved the walkie-talkie back into his pocket, his nerves on fire. He felt so helpless and restless, and he hated feeling like that. The mob outside was thick, and he hoped to hell that his friends weren't putting themselves in unnecessary danger to get him out. It seemed like they had everything under control, but he'd feel better if he could see what was happening outside. He didn't want to risk drawing any attention to the house, however, so that the team could do their job. After what felt like an eternity, the smacking seemed to not be as intense on the front door, and he contemplated whether he should chance having a look or not. If he could help somehow. If somebody was at the front and needed him to bust out some backup. Something shattered, and his blood ran cold. Fuck. It was the back door. He'd thought it had been secure enough back there, but apparently there were enough ghouls that the combined weight had broken something. "Think quick, Dante," he urged himself. He took a chance and peeked out one of the front windows, but there were too many still clustered around the door. If he opened it, there was no way he'd be able to barrel through unscathed, or he'd end up trampled as they pushed their way inside. "I think they busted in the back of the house," Lily cried from outside, and his heart skipped a beat. "You need to help Dante." What is she doing so close to the mob? He thought desperately. On foot? She sounded so close, too close, and he couldn't see any cars. And who was she talking to? Moans echoed from the kitchen and a lamp smashed to the floor as zombies began to cross the threshold into the living room. "Fuck," he barked, and peeked outside again. But there were still too many out there. There wasn't enough time. He glanced at the other end of the hall, but none of the rooms had doors that closed. Dante tore up the stairs to the second floor and spotted a decorative bench in the hallway beneath some wall sconces. He grabbed it and shoved it sideways down the stairs, creating a waist-high barrier for the ghouls to get caught on. He braced himself, tightening his grip on his blade as zombies poured into the front hall. He noticed the front door beginning to open, and his eyes widened. "They're everywhere!" he bellowed to get the zombies' attention and hopefully warn whoever it was that was attempting to come to his rescue, just a few seconds too late. As the zombies reached the barrier, Dante couldn't pay attention to the door anymore, having to focus on the task at hand. He knew the flimsy bench wouldn't hold for long, so he had to kill as many creatures as he could, and hope his rescue party would come through. "Eyes on me, motherfuckers!" he yelled as he buried his blade into the first one's forehead. He couldn't believe how many of them kept coming. The front door still didn't open, so at least whoever it was maybe coming up with another plan. Hopefully. Dante focused on the task at hand, playing his deadly whack-a-mole. At least as the bodies continued to fall, they seemed to reinforce the barrier between him and the sea of ghouls below. As they clustered all around the front lobby, he was beginning to doubt that this was going to be a viable exit. "Hey, Dante!" a voice echoed, and it took him a moment to place where it was coming from. "Dante, hey!" It sounded like it was coming from upstairs, somehow. The broken window, he realized, and stabbed one more zombie, yanking it by the shoulders to strategically drape it over the barrier, in hopes of it holding. He tore up the stairs and listened again. "Dante, you'd better be fucking alive in there!" Coleman bellowed, and Dante turned, running into the side bedroom. Jagged glass lined the window frame, and through it he could see the soldier across the way, waving at him from the window in the house next door. "Here I was hoping I could just walk out the front door," Dante joked. "Nothing's ever simple, man," Coleman replied with a shrug. "Should be able to walk out the front door of this house as long as you hurry up." Dante kicked out the rest of the jagged chunks that he didn't want to get sliced open on, and then peered down between the houses. There were enough stragglers milling around in the grass that he didn't want to land down there. Thankfully, the houses were fairly close together, so it wouldn't be too bad of a jump. The issue was the awkwardness of leaping from a sill to a sill. He shimmied his way through the frame and onto his backside, then got his feet under him until he was squatting. He reached up to find a handhold at the top of the window, and then stood up. Coleman stood by, both of his hands free. "Go for it, man," he urged. Dante wasn't sure if he slipped if the soldier would be able to catch him or haul him in, but there was no going back now. It was this or continue to battle the never-ending ocean of zombies in the front hall. He took a deep breath and leapt across, his feet finding purchase on the opposite sill. His hands scrambled around to attempt to balance him, and he managed to grip the window frame with his fingertips. When he was steady, he tucked his feet into the window and slid inside, where Coleman clapped him on the back. "We have to go get Lily," Dante said, drawing his knife once again. "Ah, you heard that, huh?" the soldier replied sheepishly, shaking his head as he headed for the stairs. "She's hardcore." Dante simply grunted in response. He knew she was hardcore. She was the baddest-ass bitch he'd ever met. But she was just one woman, and undead swarms were overwhelming. Coleman pulled out his radio. "We're about to come a-running out of the house next door to Dante's," he said. "Ready for pickup?" "Circling around," Ace came back. "Where's Lily?" "We're gonna go get her," Coleman promised. "There's a few of those fuckers out front," the redneck replied. "Get ready. As soon as I gun 'em down, you come out." "Go for it," the soldier replied as they reached the front door. Dante and Coleman readied their weapons and waited for the telltale crack of gunfire. After 5 shots, the dust seemed to settle, and Dante threw open the door. Coleman aimed his rifle immediately, but there were no ghouls in the immediate vicinity. He and Dante made a beeline for the vehicle, which had some dents and dings in it, likely from Ace bonking some corpses when he whirled around. The mob he'd left up the street were shambling back. "Go, go, go!" Dante cried as he leapt into the passenger seat. "Which way did she go?" Ace demanded as Cole shut the back door behind them. "That way," the soldier replied, pointing down the street. A few ghouls staggering around a corner showed a possible path for their friend, and Ace punched the gas. "Cap, we got Dante, just driving east to pick up Lily," Coleman said into the radio from the backseat. "She's on foot. Drew a mob away from the house. 10-4, Terrell replied immediately. We'll circle around from the other side. Maybe we can head her off. Dante's heart pounded as they screamed around the corner. The mob wasn't too big, but it was big enough, and stretched all the way across the road. He caught a glimpse of Lily's hair shining in the sun on the far side of the monsters' heads, and he reached over to honk the horn. Ace slammed on the brakes as Dante laid on the horn, letting out a long and loud bleat to draw the attention of the mob. Before they could fully even turn around, he launched himself from the car, blade in hand. Coleman popped up out of the sunroof with his automatic rifle and began systematically taking out the enemy headshot by headshot. Dante watched, eyebrow raised, impressed at the precision. Lily jogged over to the sidewalk, backing up a bit as the ghouls focused on Coleman. On the far side, Terrell and Francis sped up and screeched to a stop. They got out on their side, the hulking man going to town with his metal gloves. Coleman stopped firing when his targets were getting too close to people, and then the rest descended on the final few. Dante stabbed one in the forehead, kicking the body free to slump to the ground. Francis brought his fists together and crushed a skull between them. Terrell kicked the legs out from under a zombie and then stomped its face in with his boot. Lily darted in and drove her blade into an eye socket. As soon as the last body fell, she leapt onto Dante, launching her arms around his shoulders. He circled her waist and lifted her from the ground, holding her small body close to his. "What the hell were you thinking?" he murmured into her hair. "I was thinking you were trapped in that house," she replied, and curled her legs around his waist, holding herself up to claim his lips. Okay, gross, Lil," Ace barked from the driver's side window. Coleman chuckled, slapping his hand down on the roof of the vehicle. "We're gonna have company pretty soon, guys," he called. Dante set Lily down on her feet, neither of them particularly bothered by their awkward audience. They held hands as they faced Terrell. "Ready to scope out our safe house?" Lily asked. The captain nodded. "Let's go," he said. Chapter 10. The two vehicles pulled up to the safe house, bodies strewn everywhere. "If this is the good house, I'd hate to think what the others looked like," Terrell said dryly. Ace shook his head. "Yeah, buddy, don't ask," he retorted. "You think this place will work?" Lily asked, chewing her lip. Terrell looked around at the trees surrounding most of the property, with no other houses within view. He moved around to the side of the house, scoping out a trail leading into the woods. "Secluded?" he murmured. "Two avenues of escape?" He nodded. "Yeah, I think we can make this work." Coleman motioned to the front door. "Would you all mind clearing up the path to the kitchen?" he asked. "I need to talk to the cap real quick." Francis, Dante, and Ace moved towards the house, but Lily crossed her arms. "Hell no," she snapped. "We ain't playing this game. If you got something to say, you're saying it to all of us. None of that cone of silence bullshit. You may have been all classified before this went down, but we're all equals right now." Her friends paused, turning back around, realizing that she was right. The soldiers glanced at each other, and after a moment they both shrugged. "All right," Terrell conceded. "Coleman, what you got to say?" he asked. The sniper took a deep breath. "We had a hell of a day today, and that's with everyone out here being capable of handling themselves," he said carefully, shaking his head. "We start getting those mercenaries into the mix, and we're going to have a hell of a time protecting people who can't handle themselves." Terrell nodded. "Bailey, the kids, her mom," he said. "Shit, might as well add Cam and Philip to the list," Ace said, wrinkling his nose. "Them boys are as useless as tits on a bull." Lily sighed. "Henry, too," she added. "Smart as a whip, but considerably less dangerous than one." "And I had to say it, but Maddox as well," Dante said, shaking his head. "In his current state, he isn't going to be of much use." As his words sank in, there was a long drawn-out silence as everyone contemplated. "So what? That leaves us, your boy, Miles, and Tate?" Ace finally asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not exactly an all-star collection of warriors. Present company excluded, of course." He motioned to the soldiers with a flourish. Coleman sighed. "Well, we're going to be more effective if we don't have to worry about kids and non-combatants," he said gingerly. "So, what do you want to do?" Dante asked, tonguing his cheek. Before we make a move on QXR, I think we need to move them out of here, Coleman suggested. And put them this close to a mob? Lily demanded. Francis raised a still-gloved fist. I can stay with them, he suggested. Pretty sure we're going to need you, big fella, Ace said, patting his arm. The hulking man shook his head at the redneck. Pretty sure we're going to need a secure safe house, too, he shot back. You saw how many of those things were in town. If they come this way, we're going to need someone to clear them. He's right, Terrell added, nodding slowly. If we're being pursued, the last thing we want is a fight in front of us as well. Dante took a deep breath and crossed his arms. While I'm not the biggest fan of splitting up, this does make sense, he said slowly. At least in the short term. I'll make the preparations when we get back, Francis offered. We can leave as early as the morning to come out here. First things first, though, boys, Lily piped up. We gotta get this place secure. Let's unload, Terrell said, letting out a whistle and waving his hand above his head. Lily opened the back of one of the SUVs as Dante, Francis, and Terrell set to moving bodies out of the house. They hauled them outside and brought them past the tree line. It was unfortunate they couldn't get them farther away to avoid the smell or traumatizing any of the more fragile members of their congregation. But they were on a timetable and had to do what they had to do to clear everything as best they could and make it comfortable as a temporary home. They cleared the kitchen out of the back first, and Lily got to work organizing the kitchen and stacking supplies in the pantry. She didn't have time to do any thorough cleaning up, and the fridge was growing its own ecosystem, so she figured everyone that was going to be staying here would have enough time on their hands to clean and rearrange however they liked. Once the kitchen was clear of bodies, she and Dante shoved the couch back into the living room so that the guys could clear the hallway. Lily carried the non-kitchen supplies into the living room, making a decent stack of boxes in the corner for later organizing. Meanwhile, Coleman and Ace moved along the perimeter, using lengths of chain they'd brought to run between trees. Ace fed the line as Coleman wrapped the metal around various trunks, creating a makeshift barrier that wouldn't hold a horde, but would at least buy time and make some noise. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for the time being. Lily exited the house with her team in tow, and they approached the duo, admiring their handiwork. Terrell reached out and plucked at the finished chain barrier, nodding thoughtfully as it sprang with very little give. Anything to fortify the inside with? Dante asked, and Ace swiped his palms together, motioning towards the back shed. I haven't checked in there yet, he drawled. Let's have a look. He led the way to the shed, finding the door thankfully open. They rummaged around in the fairly large shed and found a stack of old boards that looked like they'd been discarded to use for firewood. After liberating a box of nails and 2 hammers, and they set to work boarding up broken windows and fortifying the house. Everyone worked in silence, each pound of a hammer a stark reminder that they weren't safe, that they were building this to try to keep their friends from dying, that they were about to sprint headlong into a battle that they weren't sure if they could win. It had been a long day, and though it was a relief to have completed the mission, there was still much to do. Francis has the big job of rounding up the less than capable, and the rest of them had to start really planning how the hell such a tiny group was going to go up against the beastly army that was QXR. As they made their way back to the SUVs, Terrell stopped to admire their handiwork. Coleman clapped him on the shoulder with a reassuring squeeze, and they got into the car. Chapter 11. Back in Hardyville, Kemp, Kenny, and Charlie rode around a neighborhood about half a mile from the school. Man, this is a waste of time, Charlie whined. There's nothing out here. Hell, even those dead fucks have gotten bored and wandered off. Kemp shook his head, keeping his voice level. You're the one that insisted on coming, he muttered, so suck it up, Huckleberry. Before his sour companion could retort, they pulled up outside of a house. What the hell are we doing? Charlie demanded. Going to do some spot checking, Kemp replied sharply. Make sure nobody is squatting. Charlie snorted. Yeah, fine, whatever, he said flippantly. Just be nice to get out of the car for a bit. He got out and started stretching, turning his back as he stood tall in the grass. Kenny and Kemp got out, moving forward and facing the house nonchalantly. "When I give you an order, you take off running," Kemp whispered. "You know where you're going and what you're doing, right?" Kenny simply nodded, and Charlie approached, resting his rifle on his shoulder. "So what are we doing?" he drawled. "You and I are going to check out this row of houses," Kemp replied, motioning to the buildings. "Kenny, I want a couple block perimeter check. Get moving and let me know if you find anything out of the ordinary. Go." Before Charlie could object, Kenny broke off at a dead sprint, leaving the two of them in the dust. He ran hard, turning down a street and racing towards a house. He busted inside, frantically looking for a pen and paper. He finally found a notepad in a desk drawer and tore off the cap of the pen with his teeth. He scrawled, "Paris Island, 10 a.m. tomorrow, come ready for battle," and dropped the pen, tearing for the kitchen. He grabbed a large butcher knife from a block on the counter and sprinted out the back door. He sprinted as fast as he could, leaping over fences like hurdles and moving quickly. When he reached the entrance of the school driveway, he jammed the note into the tree with the knife and then darted away. He didn't have much time, and he hoped that the knife would be obvious enough to their friends that they'd see it. But Kenny had to get back before Charlie was suspect. He sprinted back around, making sure to approach the house the others were at from the other side. He was panting from the run, though still a lot better off than most would be taking off at that speed. "Jesus Christ, man, you gonna make it?" Charlie teased as he and Kemp exited a little bungalow. Kenny nodded, leaning over onto his knees to exaggerate, catching his breath. "Yeah, just spent too long cooped up," he huffed. "Little bit off my playing shape." "You find anything?" Kemp asked, cocking his head. Kenny shook his, straightening up. "Nah, man, whole lot of nothing out here," he replied, raising his eyebrow the tiniest bit to let the soldier know the message had been delivered. "Well, go take a load off in the car," Kemp said with a wave of his hand. "We're going to hit this last house, then take off." They sauntered off, and Kenny followed the instructions, hopping into the passenger seat and leaning back. He silently prayed that the message would be found in time. Chapter 12. Several hours later, Terrell led the caravan up towards the school, slamming on his brakes and putting everyone on edge. "What is it?" Dante asked, bracing one hand against the door and putting the other on the butt of his knife. Terrell pointed at a butcher knife sticking out of one of the trees at the end of the driveway. His heart pounded in his ears, and he couldn't help but be desperate to get back to the school. What if someone had come in and slaughtered everyone, leaving a taunting message in the tree? He didn't want to voice these fears, though, so that he didn't upset his passenger. It was more likely that this was some kind of warning, and everyone was fine. Still, he had to be careful in case it was a trap. Dante furrowed his brow. "Well, that's certainly one way to send a message," he muttered, and the captain was glad that he didn't seem to share the same anxieties as him. "Stay in the vehicle," Terrell commanded, and drew his handgun, cautiously getting out of the car. He glanced back at Coleman, giving him a few hand motions before he approached the tree with the knife. His subordinate kept his hands on the wheel in the SUV directly behind, at attention and keeping his eyes peeled. He likely had the same process as his captain, and kept his head on a swivel. Terrell slowly approached the tree, senses on high alert, and then snatched the note from behind the knife. His shoulders instantly relaxed as he read it, a sigh of relief leaving his lips. He gave Coleman a thumbs up to let him know that everything was all right, and then got back into the driver's seat. "What's it say?" Dante demanded. Terrell handed it over and watched as a smile erupted on his passenger's face as he read the words. "I wouldn't swear to it," the soldier declared, "but I'd say we're about to start working on getting Grace back." He punched the gas, speeding towards the school, his heart soaring. He couldn't even imagine how Dante must feel, having been without his sister for so long, his own family deep in the pit of snakes that was QXR. The vibe amongst the group was upbeat as they all got out of the vehicles, and Dante bellowed the information to the rest of the crew, waving the note above his head. Miles emerged from the gym to greet them, and Terrell approached him, clapping him on the shoulder. "Get everyone in the lunchroom for a meeting right now," the captain commanded, and Miles nodded, hurrying off and calling to the rest of the school's residents. Terrell led the way to the lunchroom, and Lily and Ace set to making some coffee while they waited for everyone to join them. Soon their little corner of tables was bustling, and the captain did a quick once-over. All right, he said, stretching out the word as he attempted to do a head count. Is everybody here? Maddox stumbled in through the doors, his eyes red and puffy. It's all right, man, Tate said, getting to his feet. We got this. Maddox shook him off. Is this about QXR? He asked Terrell. The captain nodded. Yep, he replied. Then I'm staying, Maddox declared, sniffling and plunking himself down next to Tate. I owe those pricks a few things. Tate opened his mouth to object, but Terrell raised his hand. It's okay, the sergeant said. He's not going out tomorrow anyway. Before Maddox could snarl some choice words, Terrell raised his voice and spoke over him. We have a message from our QXR contact for a meet, he declared, holding up the note. Everyone quieted down so much that all they could hear was the bubbling and hissing of the coffee maker. And it doesn't look like it's going to be a friendly visit either. But if we're going to get Grace back, we have to risk it. Bailey gingerly raised her hand, looking around nervously. She began and then cleared her throat. Should we be concerned? No, you don't have to worry, Terrell replied, shaking his head. You and your family won't be here. Francis nodded in agreement. I'm taking us someplace safe, he said. She blinked at him in relief and grabbed his hand, gripping it tightly. A few of you others are going as well, Terrell said, addressing the room. We have to assume if things go south, they're going to strike here. Tate raised his hand. So, what's the plan? He asked. Coleman, Dante, and myself will go to Paris Island for the meet, Terrell replied. The rest of you will need to fortify this place and prepare for battle. Coleman nodded, stepping forward. And the captain here would never say it because he's an eternal optimist. But you'll also need to prepare for the unlikely event that we don't make it back at all, he added. Lily clenched her jaw, glaring at Coleman, but Dante slid an arm around her, pulling her close to him. I'm coming back, I promise, he murmured into her ear. You just make sure you're ready to kick ass if we're running from something. She smirked and patted him on the chest, wrapping her free arm around his back and squeezing him against her. We all have a lot of work to do, Terrell declared. However, I think there's time for one last big meal together. He took a deep breath. This has been one of the worst months in human history, but by God we're going to carve out a couple good hours. There was a bit of cheer from the group, though many shared worried looks as the group prepared to enjoy what may be their final meal. The end. Up next, Terrell, Coleman, and Dante make a daring raid on the Paris Island military base, while Lily leads a group to deal with the situation on the bridge in Lowcountry, Part 16.